So today we want to talk to you about accessibility, the information technology communications related to accessibility, raising awareness on accessibility issues. We want to provide tips on approaches to inclusion, ensure that a diverse environment for all types of requirements, right? So let's talk about this morning. We have three great speakers. So the first one, Jeffrey Stark. Very well respected overall in the government of Canada for his expertise on accessibility. For 25 years experience, manages the ACT program, which is a group of passionate, engaged, and enthusiastic, experienced subject matter experts in accessibility. So we're lucky to have him here. Jean-Marc Parisi, adaptive computer technology subject matter expert, over 20 years experience. He's covered the whole gambit of accessibility solutions, visual, physical, hearing, learning disabilities, so a true expert. And Juliana Rousel, accessibility subject matter expert as well on accommodation, adaptive technologies, worked in the field since 2010. She's pushing really for more open government, encourages interdepartmental sharing of strategies. So we're lucky to have her here as well and to share experience and engagement on accessibility. So I'd like to welcome the speakers to come and start the session.
Hopefully I have a working mic, which is always fun. So I'll just say hi, welcome. My name is Jeffrey Stark, as mentioned. I'm the program manager of the Accessibility, Accommodation, and Adaptive Computer Technology program at Shared Services Canada. As you may have noticed, I'm not just the head, I'm also a member of the Hair Club for Men, I guess, or what have you, because I actually got into this field before I acquired a severe disability, and then realized that there was a lot to get into. So essentially what we'll be covering today, we'll be looking a little bit about our program, who we are, what we do. We'll be talking a little bit about the things that we offer. We're going to be doing it in a very sort of hands-on way, so you'll get an opportunity to see exactly what we're talking about when we talk about accessibility, when we're talking about job accommodation, and we're talking about adaptive computer technology. So we're going to give you real-world examples of what good, bad, and ugly looks like, which for me is what makes it real. I think it's important with the upcoming legislation that it plays centerfold in a lot of what we're talking about. So we'll give you a little update on that side of things, as well as giving sort of the legal context. Then we'll get into tools, toys, and technology, but also resources on how to approach IT projects and be inclusive by design. So hopefully we'll have a good hour and a half of time here playing around with tools, toys, and tech. I will just mention that we will be showing equipment. If you don't get a chance to see it firsthand when we bring it up or when we lift it up, or if you're sitting a little too far away, we will also have it at the end of the presentation here on a table, and we'd be happy to show you what we're talking about as well in that context. So let's first talk about our program. We've been around for 27 years. We were a part of the first government department to give everybody a computer at their desk. And then we realized that the one-size-fits-all option doesn't work for everybody. So we looked around for expertise in the private and the public sector. It didn't exist. We had to bring it up from the universities in the States. And that's how we got started. Then Treasury Board got wind of what we were doing, and they said, gang, we'd like you to look a little further than the end of your nose. And we said, well, we can't do it alone. So they funded a number of our initiatives, a number of our activities, and then fast forward to today. Today we work with just about every government department. We have whole networks we work with in this space, and we've even received international recognition for the stuff we do. So we don't just provide services in the NCR, we do stuff across Canada. And it kind of boils down into three areas. Our first area is really things for people. So when we're talking about solutions for individuals with disabilities, we've got an expert in each category of disability, whether we're talking hearing, vision, cognitive learning, physical. We've got simple and we've got complicated solutions. Like, for example, even if you were in a full body cast and all you could do was breathe, we could still give you computer access. which basically means no sick leave for any of you. But legitimately, I think that's the critical side of things, is that it's never a lack of solutions. It's often an exercise in identifying what's going to work for a given individual. What type of work are they doing? What type of tasks are they running into? What's the condition? And more importantly, how has it manifested itself? Because even two people with the exact same condition could have completely different solutions in place, either because they work in a different environment, because their technical environment is different, because their condition has manifested itself differently, or a whole host of other reasons. So for me, one of the critical takeaways in this space is really there is no standard user. We can try to create a one-size-fits-all, but there will always be a need to adapt, to adjust, and to respond to different requirements. Now, from our end, we do assessments, we do evaluations, we operate a loan bank so people can try solutions and technology, which basically means that much of the work that, for example, Jean-Marc, my colleague here, does is in that space where he looks through the various tools, toys, and technology, and also looks at what the skill set of the individual is, because you don't just magically learn to use this stuff right away. It does require a period of adjustment. And your disability doesn't just go away at the end of the day. It's a full life experience. It's also a club anybody can join, which is critical, because when you look around you, you often say it's an us and a them thing. I can teach you the secret handshake, but it's a club that anybody can join. And so really what we need to be thinking of is how can we be a lot more inclusive by design? We use that term as our catchment, or as our way to describe the overarching various disciplines of this field, is we want to be inclusive by design so things are accessible by default, and strive beyond that. Then in terms of other businesses, well, we do stuff for people, yes, and we've got a huge claim to fame in that space, but we learned early on that we can't do it alone. And so a lot of what we do is also to build capacity in organizations. We do training and courses and awareness sessions. We do courses for developers on creating accessible content. We do courses for technicians on supporting adaptive technology, so that when they go in front of a user, they can give the right information and know where to go to ask questions. We have courses for content creators, courses for publishers, courses for managers, and so on and so forth. And also, of course, training for people with disabilities in a variety of technologies and options. Our third business line is the most exciting part of our work, in that we're working with new enterprise solutions, new technologies coming into the Government of Canada at an enterprise level, or for new systems. We're also working to bring new technologies into the Government of Canada, trying to communicate requirements in terms of what's actually necessary in terms of security or bilingualism or other horizontal business requirements. And so from our end, that's actually a lot of what Juliana does here, and she'll be talking to you a little bit about that side of things shortly. But essentially, there are standards we follow, and how do we make sure that we're following them when we purchase things? We often talk about separating the virtual wheelchair from the virtual wheelchair ramp, and we'll show you examples of that this morning. If you walk away with no other information, so you can all get up and leave after this, right? If you walk away with no other information, walk away with this piece. If you don't know where to go to ask questions, if you're starting a new IT project, if you're looking to accommodate an employee, if you're looking to build a system, we do one-on-one consultations or info sessions every week. They're first come, first serve in the federal public service, which means they could be as simple as, Well, we've gotten referrals from the Eye Institute at the General Hospital where they say, oh, you're a federal public servant, you need to go talk to ACT, go look at the tools, toys, and technology that might be relevant to you as your vision changes. It may be, I'm a deputy minister. We've had that in a situation where a newsletter was going out and there was complaints that some people couldn't read it due to accessibility. The deputy minister went to his HR and he said, well, what can I do? His HR basically said, well, we have this group we work with. You got training and information that can be provided. He said, great, 40 of my people, you're all going there. And so we got this massive deluge in 2 groups to essentially go in, spend an hour finding out what the topic was, giving examples, walking through actually how you make accessible communications. In this case, it was emails and Word documents. What are the standards? What are the tools? What are the resources? And they walked away within 72 hours, or at the latest a week, with a summary, with homework, because I'm a firm believer that if you give someone 25%, they'll figure out the rest. So we give them the links to the resources and the material on that specific topic. Or it could be a general awareness session. Oh, we're getting into IT procurement. We have to look at accessibility for this activity. Or, oh, we're about to buy this new enterprise solution, a collaborative tool. What standards should we be including? All of those would be info sessions. And we do them every week, back to back to back to back, usually on a Thursday. So Thursdays are a little like a circus for us. It's just back to back to back to back, item by item by item. But what's neat about it is every inquiry is a little different. Every request is a little something new to learn. And last year we did 396 of them. So we're serious busy in this space. There's a huge demand because accessibility is an important part or an important component. So often when we're talking about this space, we get asked, how much is enough? How far do I have to go? What are the policies, requirements, and other pieces in this space that are critical to know about? And if it ever, God forbid, gets to the point of a court case, how will I be judged? How are we going to look at this? Usually we start by talking about the Treasury Board duty to accommodate policy as a good starting point as far as how we should approach things. Because right in there, if I were to talk to everybody here, I'd say, well, if you work in the federal public service, you probably know or have heard of the Treasury Board duty to accommodate policy, but most people jump to a thing. I'm going to give Fred this device because Fred needs it in order to accomplish this task. It actually says right in the duty to accommodate policy, which is why we call it the duties of accommodation. It says we're supposed to be examining all systems, including IT systems and processes, and identifying barriers to people with disabilities. We're supposed to be then eliminating those barriers. So finding problems, fixing problems, maybe with a temporary solution, because we can't fix everything tomorrow. Our third duty is to essentially build inclusion in, or make it so it doesn't happen again. So find the root cause. In many cases, the root cause is actually a standard that's been missed, or a standard that's not been updated. And we'll talk about that along the way. And then our fourth duty is to accommodate, to give that person that thing, which is why it'll be critical in these demos for us to separate the virtual wheelchair from the virtual wheelchair ramp. Because the virtual wheelchair component of things might only be a small subset of the activity, but if the wheelchair ramps aren't there, dude can't get into the system, or someone is going to run into a barrier somewhere along the way. So what we want to do is we want to have that there. We want to have those virtual wheelchair ramps there before we need them. Then when we look at sort of the court side of things, we've got things like the Canada Labour Code that says that we're supposed to be proactive in avoiding injuries, and one of the ways to do that is to ensure that things are accessible. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which basically says that people with disabilities are a protected population. We've got the Canadian Human Rights Act, which says that Essentially, people have to have access to information in a usable format in a timely fashion. But more importantly, it says that we have to accommodate up until the point of undue hardship. So if we ever end up in the court scenarios, that's the argument we can say is we didn't do this for that person to allow them to do this task because it would represent undue hardship. The mom and pop organization, that's easy to argue. Oh, I run a small little airline with 2 tiny planes and we're not even pulling in a profit. I wouldn't have the money to basically make something accessible. Or I could say, oh, I wouldn't give the blind guy the job of driving the mail truck because that would put someone's health or safety at risk. Because there's only 3 arguments we can make. We can say health, safety, those are obvious, as I said, and cost. And cost isn't measured at the project level. Cost isn't measured at the organization level. In many cases, you would have to argue that it would bankrupt the federal government in order to argue cost in the courts, which is why it's pretty much never been successfully used. So when we talk about how much is enough, it's probably more than we expect. We also, one of the best examples of this in terms of how the courts handle it is Donna Jodin versus Government of Canada, where a Canadian citizen essentially said, I am not getting access to the EI system, to jobs.gc.ca, and to the census. I tried to work with the departments, and they wouldn't resolve the issues the way I needed them to be resolved. And so Donna basically took the entire Government of Canada to court. So between 2009 and 2013, our topic was sexy, and it was everybody was talking about it because essentially what the court said was, you have 2 years to meet the most modern accessibility standard at a level of compliance that's deemed to be a minimum. And we'll talk about what that level of compliance is later on, but we'll just say that in the standard that was in place at the time, there were 3 levels of conformance a person could meet when they build a system, design a piece of software, procure something, sort of a gold, a silver, and a bronze. And we were actually asked to meet the silver level. So not excelling, but also meeting a minimum level. Now, right now, up until this point, a lot of this stuff has been complaint-driven. And specifically in one department or another, or related to one or another system or solution, departments have been asked to sort of self-manage and self-monitor. But when Justin Trudeau came into power, he essentially appointed a Minister of Disability, talked about this being a mandate for creating a new legislation. They consulted with the largest, it was the largest consultation for persons with disabilities ever in Canada, and they went coast to coast on a whole bunch of topics. We were definitely along with them for the ride, so that was kind of cool. And ultimately, there's a legislation on the horizon. Its first reading was this summer. It will likely receive royal assent next year. And it really changes a lot of the dynamics and discussions in this space. Take that on.
So I'm actually here to talk about what that is going to mean for the terms of the legislation. It actually went through part of its second reading on the 19th of September and the 24th, so it was also being discussed just the other day. And what that's going to change is going to actually make everything that we have to do be proactive. We're going to have to illustrate what we're doing and what measures we're taking to ensure that we're building inclusion in and we're meeting accessibility standards. The interesting thing about that is it's not just about information communication technology. The legislation is talking about your built environment, how an employer is with accommodation with employees. It's talking about access to information as well as the ICT space. And that basically is saying, okay, these are all these governing things that we now need to look at. And this is to address a variety of disabilities. We're not talking about just meeting someone who has a vision impairment or someone with a hearing impairment. It's across all the spectrums. And with that legislation, it's actually taking into account things that are going to have proactive measures that are going to say, what's our accessibility feedback? Was there a compliance evaluation done for this product or this service? If it was, what was the ramification? Did it meet the actual accessibility requirements in that space? And in our case for information communication technology, as Jeff said, it would be that bronze level, or what's called WCAG 2.0, which actually applies to more than just web. There's a whole spectrum of that for ICT, or information communication technology, that can be applied to software, web applications, mobile applications, desktop solutions, digital space, kiosks, all kinds of things that kind of fall under that same guideline. And when we put this legislation through, we're going to have to see that big shift in government, because a lot of the requirements already existed. People just didn't have it in a clear language that they actually understood that, yes, I have to meet that in either the duty to accommodate, the Canadian Labour Board, or the Canadian Human Rights Act, the UN Charter for Persons with Disabilities. So there's a lot of areas where this kind of baseline already existed. But it's a shift in mentality and culture across government and with vendors that we work with and our stakeholders and people who are in the public service who are actually employees. Because when you come to work, you don't actually lose your rights to be a person and access the information you need to do in order to do your job. So that means that we as a government have to be proactive in what we're doing. We have to illustrate how we're doing it. We have to be open about what we're doing, what measures we've taken, where there's going to be things like third-party compliance that are probably going to come into account to kind of say what is actually happening with our content. What are we doing? What are we doing when it comes to accessing buildings? We're building a new elevator solution that's going to have a touch screen and it's going to be all this nice high tech. How does that actually work for employees? Are people actually able to interact with it? Did we consider the different types of people with disabilities? Or people with temporary injuries or situational impairments where they're actually unable to, for whatever reason, to access what we're doing. So as we move with very quick and advancing technology, we actually have to be able to move in that same agile pattern to meet the legislation requirements.
So what is neat about this space is, yes, it's a big challenge, and yes, it is a many-pronged piece. When we look at this stuff, really the critical parts of it are the recognizing that it touches everything. So we almost need to look at it the same way as we look at any other horizontal business requirement. How do we approach official languages? How do we approach security? All of these are good parallels to kind of look at how we're going to look at accessibility, because it's not going to be one group's job or one area's job or one space's job. And just because we did it one way previously doesn't mean we don't have to evolve. And that's a critical thing. Many times people say, oh, we're going to solve the accessibility issue. I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And then they solve it for one area in one way. So for me, what we're going to do along the way here is we're going to talk a little bit about those various aspects of things. For me, there are three in IT. If you're leading an IT project or involved in an IT project, you probably need to look at three category or technology categories. You probably need to look at, well, you do need to look at the enterprise system software and solutions and communications that your organization creates, produces, procures, develops. You also need to look at the workplace devices that we purchase. We also need to look at the solutions that we offer for individuals with disabilities, not as an alternative, but as an in addition to those pieces. Because even when we meet 100% compliance, there will likely be some additional steps that are necessary. Sometimes that's some sort of assisted help, but most of the time we want to preserve the independence and the dignity of the individual, and therefore anything we can do to do that is a better approach or a more modern approach. And then if you look at those three categories, we also need to look at it not just at the procurement and development stage, although if we miss that, we're kind of screwed, because it's really hard to get juice out of a rock. You can paint it as orange as you want, squeeze it as hard as you want, but if you asked for something that doesn't contain the juice you need, you will be squeezing it until you're retired and on afterwards. So yes, it's the procurement and development stage, but it's also the implementation stage. If I buy a piece of software and then I add a government layer that handicaps the solution for people with disabilities, I'm no further ahead. As an example, if I get SharePoint and I put it into a department and I don't look at how I'm going to implement it, what templates I'm going to use, what content I'm going to put in there, how we're going to manage that side of things, I'm going to run into barriers, recognizing that there will also likely need to be workarounds. And then how do we handle things in today's modern development environment? Agile procurement, iterative development, the notion that nothing is solid anymore. It's always a fluid evolution in development. How do we make sure that the thing we got and the thing we implemented doesn't break down the road from an accessibility standpoint? So it really is a holistic approach. Now, the interesting thing with upcoming legislation is the simple fact that you could start a drinking game around the term accessibility, and you'd be drunk within the first hour of going into any event or activity, because accessibility is the most overused term in this space out there, which is why I'll try to give you some alternative language to use to better separate things. Because even in the international space, like for example, I went to a conference on technology and people with disabilities. I sat in on a session. It was labeled, How We Made the Harry Potter Website Accessible. Dude, we've got wizards and accessibility. Come on. That doesn't excite you. It certainly excited me when I went in there. Unfortunately, when I walked out of that presentation, I walked out saying, that's 45 minutes of my life I will never get back. Because how that session should have been labeled was how we made the Harry Potter website work for one user in one way using one technology and one version of that technology, and how when any of that ensemble of things changes, including different user, how we have to go back and do it all over again. So for me, when we talk about accessibility in an IT context, it is critical that we start by talking about accessibility as a set of standards we follow. Not the world according to Jeff, although I like the world according to Jeff, but standards that are internationally recognized. The great thing is, we're not the only ones moving in this space. All kinds of other areas are moving in this space. The EU, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the US. In Canada, we've got legislation that already exists and new ones coming up at the provincial and even often down at the municipal level. So it is definitely a hot topic everywhere, and by referencing international standards, we start off with a good foundation. What's great is that accessible standards don't just benefit people with disabilities. They essentially provide a framework that is positive for everybody, whether you have a disability or not. In the real world, we talk about this in the way you build the environment. So you can look around a building and you can say, there's a wheelchair ramp. There's an electric door opener. Things are a certain width. Here's some signage in tactile form, in high contrast, in Braille. And when I get into the elevator, it tells me what floor I'm on, both visually and auditorily. All kinds of things that are in there. And it's not just people with disabilities who benefited from that. When I brought my daughter in and I was pushing a stroller, I used the electric door opener. I used the wheelchair ramp. It's the same thing in the IT space. Accessibility actually is good design. If you go talk to the IM people about accessible document creation or accessible web applications or websites, and you start actually getting into the nitty-gritty of the topic, they'll go, no, that's good structure and semantics. That's metadata. That's all IM stuff, because it's good design. So for me, when we talk about accessibility, we start by talking about a foundation of standards. And what we're going to do along the way here is we're going to look at what good, bad, and ugly looks like in that space. We also recognize that there is no standardized user, although we have users with vision, hearing, cognitive learning, physical and combinations thereof. And they may have tools and technologies and solutions that they use. As an example, in our first demo in a minute, we're going to look at vision replacement technology, which is basically the technology that someone who's blind might use. Someone who doesn't see or doesn't use sight as their primary means of interaction. Whether we're talking a desktop solution, a mobile solution, even in hardware devices and kiosks and so on, there's tools and technology available. I'm just going to turn up my volume here, and I'll say I have the mobile phone that everybody gets on their right now in the government. This is the Samsung Galaxy S8. It's one of the devices that is being deployed as a BlackBerry replacement. I have a layer of technology that runs on this. That's essentially my virtual wheelchair. So when I touch the screen,
Double tap to activate.
it reads something out. For those who didn't hear that,
Email. Double tap to activate.
it might have been a little fast for you guys. I could accommodate you. But at the end of the day, that would be mind-numbing for me. I would get nothing done in a day if I had to listen to a computer talk to me all day. So one of the things that we do, I mentioned earlier, it's not just giving dude this tool. There's also a skill development component. So that's one of the things my team does, is work with someone to develop that skill to understand audio at a faster rate. I'll just say, I can do things like, it said the first one was Aquamail, the second one was Gmail, just to prove that I understood what it's saying. I can say, read me everything.
Gmail. Messenger Lite. Hangouts. Workspace. Keep notes. File commander. Calendar. Facebook. News.
And it will go item by item by item. I can move by section or move by content or move by items in a whole variety of ways. So that works for me. I could also, if I were a Braille user, I could also use a device like this. So I wouldn't even have to have it talk to me at all. This right here is a Bluetooth Braille display. This can connect wirelessly to my mobile phone. So if I read Braille, I could essentially read what's on the screen here in a structured form. The little dots here on where my finger are raise and lower to make text in Braille. And you can move through content with it. Another example of the same thing, that one's maybe better for large reading. Here's one that's better as a mobile device or as a mobile interface. Because here we have the screen, here we have a keyboard. So a Braille user can actually do input and output on this device and never take their phone out of their pocket. So you're in a meeting, you want to read a document, you want to reply to emails, you can do so and nobody else will know what you're doing because it's all just little dots raising up in front of you and behind you. Wirelessly connected to a mobile device. There are similar ones for the desktop. There might be one on the screen a minute from now, where essentially you will see the larger screen. Just like in when we're talking about your standard screen, mobile phones have smaller screens, desktops have larger screens. So on the screen is a larger screen of Braille display, more for a desktop computer. What's interesting about this is if you're a developer and you're designing a piece of software, most of the work for you is done by the operating system or done by the computer or the tool the user uses. So you don't really need to worry as much about the virtual wheelchair as you do about the way you program things or develop things or design things. So we're going to look at an example of that in a minute. We're going to look at a commercially available website a couple of years back, which we took during our developers course. This site lacks object information, which is one of the many types of things that are necessary for ensuring that we have the virtual wheelchair ramps for technology users. What's interesting about that side of things is we're going to be using the most advanced screen reader on the market, which is the tool someone who's blind would be using. We're going to be using standard Windows, standard Internet Explorer. We're going to be doing the most common task someone would do, which is essentially tabbing item by item on a web page. And here you'll hear the experience and see the experience that someone who's blind would have when that site is missing one of the elements or a virtual wheelchair ramp for accessing it. Hopefully we can hear this. Okay, so the audio is supposed to be plugged in here, but we'll move the microphone maybe.
Well, I'm bringing it to the mic. But
So maybe we'll just restart.
okay.
So you may have noticed a minute ago, it was reading HTTP this, HTTP that. Every time it's going to clip off, that's the user hitting the tab key.
http://www http://
So
http://
why are we getting URLs? They were never meant to be human readable. But they're all the screen reader knows is where these things point. I hope you hear the frustration. As the user hits tab, that's useless. That's useless. That's useless. That's useless. That's useless. That's useless. If I were a developer and I had a screen reading user hit this, they'd be chasing me down the hall.
Text.
Yay, some text.
Store safe shopping guarantee combo box books. Edit.
So here we hit an input box, like an edit field. What do we type in?
Search button.
Maybe a search. Maybe we typed in our search there. We have no idea.
Edit.
And then you can go to the next one. So we have an input box, a search button, and another input box. One of them we know is probably a search. The other, we have no idea what to put in there. So we took this same one page during our developers course and we retrofitted it for accessibility on the third day to essentially put in practice what we had talked about. Here's what it should have read at the time.
Skip straight to Barnes & Noble homepage link.
Okay, it used to be the Barnes & Noble website, yes? Shame on them at the time.
Account link. Help link. Order status link. Home
So
link.
these are the same items that a minute ago
Bookstore
were reading
link.
HTTP this,
Books link.
HTTP that.
College textbooks link. Out of print link. Music link.
And when we get down to the edit field,
Software link. Gifts
you
and
can stop. It'll tell us we have a quick search as our first item. And we could get more information to know what exactly that quick search is and how it works. Let's look at the 2 pages. I think that's an important part of the exercise because let's first see, this is the inaccessible version of that page. It's very graphically rich. It has all the standard things you'd see on the web. It's got multimedia, it's got graphics, it's got stuff that you enter in, it's got interactive components, it's got links, it's got form fields, it's got you name it. It's marketing all over the place. And now let's look at how much we had to compromise in ensuring that that page was accessible. So here's the accessible version. We'll go back and forth a couple of times just to make the point. You may notice that there's not much we've essentially changed. And what we've changed is just maybe a little bit of the layout in terms of margins and so on. Because on their version of the site, they felt it was okay to assume that everybody has the same size screen. And we said, well, we've got little screens on phones and big screens on computers and even larger screens in projection environments. So maybe that thing should grow and shrink based on the content you're looking at. And that's the critical piece about this is the fact that the majority of the requirements when we're developing software, systems, documents, and material, when we look at accessibility from the beginning, does not change the way something looks. It's many times it's just stuff under the hood, coding practices, development practices. And there's not a lot of work to do. That's the important thing. To add one item or to fix one of the items on that page, it was basically 8 characters that we added to the code. That basically added in an alt equals and described what that image is pointed to in terms of the section, the search section, the link section. But what's also important to realize is it's not the world according to Jeff. And we run into that a lot of the time, where essentially my favorite example in this space is Environment Canada. They have the love of the color green. I've worked with them for years. I love them to death, but green is like their crack cocaine. So I had one graphic designer come up to me. He brought a banner, and he goes to me, he goes, "Jeff, look at this beautiful banner. It's green text on a green background. Maybe it's bright and dark, but look at the synergy. Look at the elegance. Look at how the foreground and the background flow together." Who cares? Nobody can read it. But what's important is it wasn't my interpretation. By referencing a standard, and that's essentially what we did. We said, okay, well, if we look at the standard for where you're putting it, that'd be the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, 2.0, or now it's 2.1. And under that 2.0 standard, in there, one of the items says that when you pick foreground colors and background colors of things like text, that you have to take the color values of both, the foreground and the background. You run them through an equation. It gives you a luminosity contrast ratio, which essentially says, if it's 4.5 to 1, that's good enough. We meet that silver level I was talking about earlier, or AA. We can exceed it, and we can even ask people to exceed it. That'd be great. Let's shoot for the gold. Let's excel. Let's not just say mediocrity is enough. But it takes a lot of that back and forth out when we have standards to follow that say, yes, we need to be at least that level to be compliant. Because it can get very easily into oh, that works for Joe. Joe has low vision, so Joe can read that text, so therefore that text is just fine. You can never check every user's scenario in every situation, but we can at least set a foundation. So just so we're not talking about vision replacement technology only, let's look at another category of disability. Let's look at vision enhancement technology, or someone who might have a difference of vision, whether that's low vision, color blindness, color sensitivity, you name it. So we're not going to use any adaptive technology at all. We're going to use the stuff already built into the operating system. When we start this video, you'll see 2 websites, both very good until we start to need the features that are built into the operating system. So we're not going to do anything special here. We're just going to say, dude can't see this. And to make it real for you guys, we're going to make the video a little blurred along the way, just to give you a sense of vision loss. Go ahead. So the 2 sites we're looking at, great, graphically rich. We're going to go into the settings, and we're going to make it high contrast black. We're going to do the same thing in the browser, because sometimes we have to turn those settings on. Someone with low vision, well, the only thing throwing light at your eyes is the text and the material, so this becomes readable. Not exactly the same as you expect it, but readable, unless you hit the second site. If you can use the second site, you're truly special. And what's interesting is both sites looked professional, graphically rich. I'm actually a really good example of someone with low vision. When I use a computer, I use it completely with that color scheme, because the white haze over my eyes makes it so that the only thing that shoots through it is light. So if the background is lit, I can't separate it from the foreground. But what's neat is you guys don't have to think about any of that when you're developing something, except for ensuring that you're compatible, that the coding practices follow the standards. And if they have, that doesn't mean you have to go out and make your own little widget, for example, if you're making a web app, because the browsers already support this, whether it's Firefox or IE or Edge or whatever. And it just means that you have to support the stuff that's already built in. Just to give you an idea that of other solutions that someone might use in this space, when we talk about low vision or vision enhancement technology, there's high-tech, medium-tech, and low-tech solutions. So regardless of what you might use on the computer, you might have other tools and technology that you have in your backpack or carrying around with you. Maybe you're not even at maybe you're not even at work. Maybe you're at a meeting like this or a workshop like this, and you might bring a tool, a toy, or a technology with you to participate or keep track of what's going on. Shamark? Low tech maybe first. Yeah.
This is a magnifier. Okay, we call it the fisheye. The nice thing about this magnifier is you don't need to adjust. You just put it on a piece of paper you need to read, and because it's concave, you can look at different angle. Low tech.
So it's not always the big high-tech piece of technology that someone might need. Sometimes it's a $50 magnifying glass or magnifying lens. The nice thing about that one is it avoids neck, back, and shoulder injury because you move the content as opposed to your body.
Sometimes you may need an electronic magnifier with a light in the back, and there's basically a camera. It will actually magnify the fonts. You could choose your own background, and you can choose your own magnification. And the newest model today will actually OCR the document and read it for you through a voice synthesizer.
So you can have it take that white piece of paper and make it high contrast like I showed you in the demo in the video here in terms of solutions.
Now, if you want
Even for
something
paper.
really, sorry?
Even for paper.
Yeah. If you want something really neat, this is called the OrCam. The latest model is much more smaller. So as you can see, I have a camera here. And what it does, if I look at it and I point my finger, it will actually take a picture and read what's written on the pamphlet. You can also do face recognition. I could program it to when I see my colleague here, Julian, every time I would see it, it would say, Julia is in front of you.
What's neat is it's completely self-contained. So there's no internet, and yet it still makes use of machine learning, a camera, and a database of data to essentially do object recognition, do reading of text, do facial recognition. And so it's the high-tech side of things, but it's definitely one of the more interesting things because that means that someone like me can sit in the back row of your meeting and point at this screen and have it read me the text that's up on the PowerPoint. So 3 examples of the same issue. I come to meetings, I want to read text. Here's 3 ways to slice it, just to show you a little bit of the virtual wheelchair, not just the wheelchair ramps. So that's why when we talk about this stuff in terms of what end users need, recognizing there is no standard user. Let's go into another category of disability. Let's talk about injuries. Let's talk about physical access. Let's talk about mobility and dexterity enhancement technology. And we're going to start off by showing you some examples of it. Shamark?
All my clients have different conditions. It can be physical, cognitive, and this is not the keyboard you need after the Oktoberfest. It's basically for someone who has a trimming condition. As you see, there is a grid right here. So when if I have a trimming condition, when I activate that key, I don't activate the key beside. It's got nothing to do with a vision. It's all about dexterity with your hand.
So if you have Parkinson's, where your hands are shaking, a low-cost solution, getting a piece of plastic created over a keyboard, or getting a larger sized keyboard if it's severe tremors.
Who would need a keyboard like that? Any clue? Yes, madam. So right hand usage. Notice that when I put my hands on it, all the keys are very close. So the wrist is hardly moving, okay? You can even program all the keys to have sub-function. So for a right-hand user, it even comes with its own tutorial because the learning curve on this one is quite high. But for some user, that could be a solution.
So one-handed access,
Thank you.
if you think about it, you're doing twice the amount of work with one hand. So you want to make sure that you're doing it in as safe a fashion as possible, which is one of the reasons there are so many one-handed keyboard options out there. What I can say is we have seen users, one user in particular, who was typing one-handed, who did the keyboard or the typing tutor with the application, and who's now about 40 words a minute one-handed, which is actually faster than some of my two-handed colleagues.
Beats me. This is also a keyboard. So if you have fused fingers or no fingers and only the usage of your palm, notice the green on top here, and I have the letter M here in color green. So if with my palm I do two direction up, oh, sorry. It will actually do the letter M. So it uses direction. If I want to do the number 7, 7 is in orange here, and orange is right here, so I would do like this, just a little. If you tap on it, this is why it's broken, you can actually control the mouse.
We have 2 or 3 units. That's the one that we bring to demos
problem.
because everybody has a desire to twist it. And so they twist it and break it on us. But
Yes.
ultimately, if you had fused fingers or no fingers, this would be a way to do input. And like any keyboard, it's not going to be the solution for everybody. You're going to use it because you need to use it, and maybe because it makes you faster at doing input or reduces the risks associated with developing a secondary disability or an injury.
So if we look at injury, where some users cannot use the palm, the wrist, and want to avoid pronation and the movement of the finger, this is the advantage kinesis, where your hand is on a resting position, and look at all the keys are very close to each other. So my wrist is not moving, and my finger are hardly moving. For some person with certain condition, with carpal tunnel or whatever, that could be a solution. One of the very popular keyboard that we propose for someone who are injured is the Kinesis Freestyle. The nice thing about this, because we all know we're all different. Some are wider, some are smaller. You want to avoid this, which is the pronation, okay? The nice thing about this keyboard, it comes with multiple kit, and you decide the distance. If you're 6'5", 300 pounds, you're much more wider, you can actually widen the keyboard, because you don't want to type like this. Ideally, if you could type vertically, that would the injury are much less. It's more than that. If you hold your 2 hands like this for an hour, and if you hold your 2 hands like this for an hour, this is much more painful.
So we actually looked at the kind of assessments, ergonomic assessments people were getting back. And there were 4 keyboards that were commonly, or keyboard attributes that were commonly being recommended. In a couple of departments, as part of their standard offering, they made this keyboard available after doing an evaluation because the kits that are available for it actually replace the 3 other keyboards that might be recommended. So instead of having 4 different keyboards that are from different manufacturers, one of which we quite frankly found broke all the time, it had a ball joint in the middle, and you'd type on it, it would slowly go down and down and down, and you'd have to readjust it. We essentially standardized on one other type of alternative keyboard with a variety of kits. So then when a user gets a new computer, they get a computer or a laptop, they get a keyboard or a split keyboard. And if they need a kit, they get the kit, allowing them to not have to ask necessarily for something special after the fact. It's just there and available.
This is the IntelliKey. It has a membrane. You can actually create your own design. It will read the barcode, and you can switch it live. I had a user who had severe arthritis that was wearing metal rings on all of his fingers to avoid that, how do you call it, when you bend your fingers. She couldn't bend her fingers. I showed her the keyboard, and for her that was a good solution because one, it requires almost no pressure and no need to bend your fingers when you're typing. I have a colleague who uses an helmet with a stick that also uses a keyboard like this. And the nice thing is it's got a section that controls the mouse because you can create your own layout. You can switch a layout depending on the type of application you also do.
What's neat is you can print out your own layouts, and you can have more than one beside the other. So you can have it as large or certain functions on it. You can say, oh, I do a lot of word processing, so I use these macros all the time. You can even color code it too.
So again, I have some client who cannot apply any pressure on her fingers. So this is a virtual keyboard. Try to demo it to you. So you basically put it on a surface, and it will draw a keyboard. Let me show you. You can see it. Now it shouldn't read like this, but basically when you touch a key, you're actually using a keyboard. So yes. Virtual keyboard.
So what's neat is it's a laser keyboard that draws the keyboard in the air. What's neat about our space is often we're not using something how it was originally intended to be used. That keyboard was originally designed for someone who's traveling to connect to their laptop or their tablet or their mobile phone and have a keyboard available, say, on the tray on an airplane or what have you. But what's important for us was you can take the same keyboard, raise it a couple of inches off the surface, maybe put a little bit of foam underneath, and now have a keyboard that is zero pressure. So for someone with burns on their fingers, nerve-ending damage, where physical contact is painful, you can type in the air. A lot of what we look at in our space is really adapting other technologies for use by people with disabilities, as the virtual wheelchairs for a wide variety of user requirements. Maybe go to macros and...
We have a lot of clients with translation, and a lot of them are injured because they're measured by the word. They have to produce a certain number of words every day. And a lot of them, for example, the worst thing you can do with the mouse is when you select some text. Because what you do, first of all, you reach for that mouse, you grip that mouse, and you grip the button, and you start selecting. So a lot of them were injured on the right hand with that type of movement. We had to develop a solution that will let you select text without using a mouse. So what we have here is it's a next key. So we learned him to move that cursor within the text. So if I move the cursor in the beginning of the text, if I press on that button here, it will select first word. If I press again on it, second word, third word, and so on. The button beside, I go line by line, paragraph per paragraph. Hold text, copy, and paste. So you can do all the selection you do without having to do that movement that created the injury.
Now, what's interesting about that aspect of things is A, the technology he's showing here, which is hardware macros, and this particular device itself, was not designed for people with disabilities. It was actually designed for people who are working on an assembly floor and have to use different machines and equipment to complete tasks. It just so happens that the macroing system that it makes use of is tremendously useful for us, especially when the systems and software someone has to use are accessible or follow a standard. So what's neat is that most of the translation bureau folk, they have to use an application called Termium. And because Termium was designed following accessibility standards, by that I mean object information was present on every item, that everything could be navigated by keyboard commands, and a variety of other pieces. Jean-Marc was able to do, okay, well, once you've selected that word in the document you're in, hit this one button on the X key, on the macro. And that macro then loaded the browser, went to Termium, went into the section of Termium that they use, went to the search engine field, brought the focus there, pasted the word that it had just copied into the clipboard, hit the submit button, waited for the Termium page to reload. When it reloaded, brought the focus down to the first search result, copied it into the clipboard. And now the user was ready to go back to their document and paste it in if that was the right word, saving maybe 20 to 30 clicks and movements and tabbing and keyboard commands, rolling it all into this one single action. Because we've got lots of employees in the federal public service who are injured, and often the work we're trying to do isn't just to give them access, but to make sure that when they have restrictions, we can get the biggest bang for their buck. So that if you're told you only type 20 words an hour, and after that you have to use another technology, how do we make that 20 words or that 20 minutes or that hour every 2 hours or whatever happens to be recommended by their treating professional, how do we make it so that they have the biggest bang for their buck in that one activity? And that's really the crux of our work on our side. But where it becomes really complicated is when the systems and the software and the solutions don't follow those accessibility standards. Then it becomes a real complicated scenario. I'll let Jean-Marc finish with a couple of other examples, and then we'll look at an example of what good, bad, and ugly looks like when we're designing or buying a system from that perspective. I'll also just say what's neat is in our space, a lot of the new technologies become mainstream. Those macros, well, they're available to anybody in the Translation Bureau, because who wouldn't want to be able to copy a word and do all that work with one step? Same thing when we talk about voice recognition. Who wouldn't want to be able to talk to their device? I mean, now we see it in assistants. Same thing with text-to-speech. All this stuff has been in our space for 20 years. Whether we're talking about word prediction, you got your BlackBerries and your mobile phones that predict text. Originally designed to allow someone with a physical disability to type faster. We've had that stuff since the DOS days. So a lot of the things that we think of as, oh, that's for that one user in that one way, in that one scenario, eventually find their way into mainstream and become that benefit for everybody. We often talk about the technology in this space being the necessity for someone with a disability and the luxury for everybody else of good design. You have a couple other things you wanted to show, Jean-Marc,
Yes.
before we move on to the video?
So I have a lot of clients who are injured on the right side because heavy mousing. Some applications are crazy. There's so many clicks on it that a lot of them cannot click anymore because severe carpal tunnel and so on. So we have to find a way to avoid the clicking, but also sometimes the scrolling. Scrolling is also a problem for a lot of my clients. To do it without doing it with the right hands. How do we do this? We use a switch system. For example, we move the activity on the left hand, but or the feet. If I want to click, I can click with my feet, single click or double click. I could also click with that zero pressure switch with the left hand. I can do this. Or it could be with the right hand. Maybe this is a problem, but not this. When I want to scroll down, I scroll down this way. Or I use a almost zero level pressure switch. That's a pressure which requires almost no pressure. And then I can do some other activity. As example, I have some clients when they want to select, they just press on this switch and it will continuously select until he moves his finger up. So we call it, it's a concept calling spreading the load, not overtaxing the right hand and that movement by moving it in another location. It could also be, I have some clients who cannot click at all. They cannot point at all. So what they have, they'll use a sip and puff, and they will have a dot either on their glasses, where by moving their head, they move the mouse cursor. And with the sip and puff, they can emulate the right click by sipping or puffing, right click, double click. and so on. Those are severe case of mobility.
Now what's neat is all of these are switches, all the things he's shown you here. And there are hundreds of different switches. What's really cool in the latest generation of this stuff is now we 3D print switches too, because you want to leverage that one action or that one thing that person can do and make the most out of it. So even in that scenario, so Jean-Marc here showed you a sip and puff switch. If you're in a full body cast, you now have a way to control the computer in 5 or 6 different solutions. There's not just one solution. There are 6 different ways you could do it, of which Jean-Marc talked about one. We could also do Morse code for data entry, where is dit and is dot. We could do scanning, where there's a single action to start and stop, a little like what Stephen Hawking was using to do a lot of his computer control. So the critical thing in this space is that there really is no standard user. There's all kinds of solutions. There's no one piece. It's a blended solution that starts at the end, that starts at the enterprise tool or the environment, the workplace device or what have you, and works its way up to the end user's requirements in terms of what additional pieces do we need to provide. But the more we bake into the clay before we actually build custom solutions, the simpler the solution is, because it's always a blended solution. So for example, in the laser keyboard Jean-Marc showed earlier, well, dude might not be typing all day with that. He might just be typing his password in and a couple of other things, then using voice recognition to control the computer. He may use a switch to do a specific action or activity, like we talked about on the Termium website. And it's an ensemble of solutions that's enabled by that standards compliance. I might just stop there, Jean-Marc.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, we're going to look at an example of good, bad, and ugly here. Here's another end user's solution. This is a federal public servant. He's using a low-tech piece, which is a head stick, which is basically a helmet with a metal stick and a soft point on the end. A touch screen, and if you look really closely, you'll notice that the touch screen has a transparent keyboard overlaid on top of it. That's because he doesn't use the touch screen as a mouse. He uses it as a keyboard so he can read and move in the same plane without moving elsewhere. We've tried all kinds of other solutions. He's used the stuff that tracks your eyes, that tracks your nose, that tracks your head, that clicks on this and clicks on that. But ultimately, this set of solutions is where he's at his most efficient and where we've reduced the largest amount of risks for future injury. The downside is that the site he's actually on may not be accessible. It wasn't at the time. He can navigate everything by keyboard on the computer, in Word, and all the applications he uses day to day, on most of the web pages he uses. But on this particular travel website, he can't move the keyboard focus to the calendar to pick his date for travel. And dude likes to travel. He travels both professionally and personally and organizes travel for other people. So even if he gets someone to come over and pick the date for him, which is, quite frankly, sucks, because if the site were fully accessible, he'd never have to do that. Even if he picks the date himself, if we were to fast forward this video 20 minutes, you would see him hit the submit button. And then you'd hear him swear like a sailor because it says, your session has timed out. Go back and do it all over again. And do it faster too, by the way. So when we talk about accessibility, it's not when he comes to the site that it needs to be present. It's throughout. I could say, dude's managed to get it fixed through a complaint process, and that's great, but he'll run into it in other scenarios. And that's where we all have a role to play. Where we all have a scenario, recognizing that I've shown you a lot of bells and whistles, a lot of tools and toys and technology, showing you that I can say in the federal public service alone, There are over 130 different pieces of software and 4,000 different technical aids for people with disabilities. So we will not have standardized users anywhere along this space. Recognizing that we have a role to play not just at the beginning, but throughout the process. One of the critical things, if you go back and you sit around any type of IT activity, whether that's implementing something, purchasing something, developing something, if you would ask just one question, what standard do you follow? At what level are you meeting of that accessibility standard? Not is it accessible? Not we're going to send Fred through this because he's got a disability to try it, to tell us it's accessible or not. It's how have we verified that it meets a standard and at what level have we asked for? Because if we haven't even defined it at the beginning, it's like any other horizontal business requirement. The later on in the process we start doing this, the more challenging and difficult it is. If we wait till we've got something completely built and then we start looking at accessibility, we've missed the boat. It's too late. Chances are it will be 200 times the cost of doing it at the beginning. So we can't fix everything tomorrow, but we can certainly fix everything going forward. And if we start asking that basic question as our first piece, we're one step further ahead. Because there are standards that exist for everything. There are standards for documents. There are standards for websites, and there are standards for web applications. There are standards for desktop applications. There are standards for hardware. And if we start asking for them in our contracting, like for example, at shared services, we're buying a whole bunch of multifunction printers. And in the contract, we've referenced international standards for how we want those big beasts to be inclusive for people with disabilities. We're doing the same sort of thing on the next generation email client, our email solution. We're doing the same thing in a variety of other projects, referencing standards so that we can at least know where we're going and at what level. What's neat is we're not alone. And it's not the interpretation even of the Government of Canada in many cases. We reference often the European Union's accessible procurement mandate and their related toolkit, because the toolkit is actually an internationally recognized piece. You want to talk about that?
So the EN 301-549 procurement toolkit has actually been built to meet the standards of the Web Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. It actually just adopted 2.1 and was fully adopted across all of Europe. Those same standards are actually used by Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and they actually use the same web standards that we've been mandated to under court obligations and other things, as well as being just the right thing to do. And when we're looking at those standards, it actually will directly map to all the different types of disabilities that we talked about today. So vision replacement enhancement, hearing replacement enhancement, mobility or physical access, and all of those components are actually built into what's called functional requirements. So if you go to this toolkit and you're going to look at what you're going to go and purchase or what the requirements you might want to consider are, you can say, hey, we're going to purchase cloud computing. What components do we actually need to consider? If you're going to get something for cloud computing, do we need to make sure that the documents that come with it are accessible? That if we are getting a support service contract with it or support services that are offered to help with it, that they're done in an inclusive way. And so they actually will give you all the functional requirements for all of those steps. So when Jeff talked about procuring printers, it actually said, okay, you're procuring hardware, it's printers. These are the specifications that you might need to consider. When you look at like a telephone or a Polycom, you'll notice the number 5 has a little raised bump. It's actually used to orient people who are unable to actually see it, and that's kind of already built into an office space. So when we're talking about building accessible conference spaces or boardrooms, accessible IT purchases, things like that, all of those components exist and give us something to reference. The interesting thing is that that's something that the Government of Canada is probably looking to explore on how we can go and have something that's going to be that way, that's going to meet our requirements for official languages, things like that, that are not part of that standard. Because the EN toolkit is actually only available in one language unless you go specifically to the governments that have adopted it to get their translated version and support documents. So that's one of the things that we have to kind of look at as an accessibility initiative for the government to, hey, to heads up to, we're moving to this legislation, these are things that can help us get there. You'll see some of that happens when we've now adopted, and TBS just released the digital standards. So there's 10 different standards on how we design with users. We are going to do a continuous or iterative approach that everything is going to be accessible or inclusive by default in design. In order to do that, we actually have to think about it when we're procuring stuff, we're planning a project. Like one of the things I often hear is, oh, I didn't actually plan or don't have any budget to go and do the accessibility testing. Well, guess what? You built in time to do security, you built in time to do your translation, you built in time to make sure it was private, so you actually have to make sure that you've actually met the accessibility requirements that's actually part of your project. So when you know that going in and you know what those standards are, and you know what the procurement requirements are, and you have those functional statements, you can actually go and say, hey, this is what we need. How are you validating that this is what you're giving me? So when we talk to a vendor, having something like a declaration or a capability statement attestation of what level of compliance they meet, what standard they followed, gives us something to say, okay, now we're going to do an evaluation of that product. Is it actually meet the standards they said they did? And we have a baseline to refer to. And because the neat thing with this is because it is an international standard, it's a tool that's being used globally, everybody's asking for the same things. And so when we're all asking for the same thing, every piece of technology we buy, everything that we retrofit or change or update will also be falling in line to asking for those same things and supplying the same things. That's why you'll see companies like Microsoft and Google who've made huge leaps in accessibility. You're looking at using a Microsoft product, they actually have built-in accessibility checkers for Word, for almost all of the applications that are built into the Office suite, so you can do at least some of the baseline things. The other thing that we're looking at now is whether or not what we need to do to actually ensure that the software that we're using is accessible. So not just what's going out onto the front end and what everybody is going to see and the public is front facing, it's what employees are actually using. Can they actually navigate the software? Can they do those things? And those are things that the government has not necessarily really considered before. Even though like in the duty-due accommodate and things like that, it's kind of been there, it's not been necessarily focused on to show that we're proactively meeting those measures. And so adopting things like that toolkit, adopting things like following the new most modern standard, which you may see will fall under the new enterprise architecture for the Government of Canada, would be the adoption of 2.1 for WCAG, which is the new version of the Web Accessibility Content Guidelines.
What's really great about the Accessible Procurement Toolkit is that not necessarily the contract clauses it produces, but it gives you evaluation grids, itemized items, so that we can all be using the same language when we're doing things. What's also important to realize, though, is it only gives you the ones that are mandatory. And by that I mean those would be the ones that we should be defining as, well, required. So when we look at the Web Accessibility Standard as an example, we mentioned there's a gold, a silver, and a bronze. It's only going to give you the silver requirements so that you have in your procurement activity or your project plan the minimum of what needs to be there. Over and above that, you should be shooting for a higher level. We shouldn't be shooting for mediocrity. So in order to create an environment of competition where companies are not just aware of the minimum, but are trying to shoot in innovative ways to solve issues and problems that come up, we should be also looking to include the gold level items as rated criteria, because some of them are dirt simple to do. And why shouldn't a company get recognized for doing a little bit more than what the minimum is? In addition to that, the nice thing is that there, as Juliana said, there are functional criteria. So even if you don't find a technology category in their set of requirements, they have overall performance statements that define in a technology agnostic way that it must be usable without relying on color, that it must be usable by this audience or that audience, to add that extra layer so that when we start getting into the vagaries of, oh, well, we're doing something in this space with AIs and cloud computing, how do we make sure that if we're doing something unique, we've captured everything? So from that perspective, and I'll go to slide 53, I think. When we talk about this space, I think it's critical to kind of recapture what we talked about. The first one is that it isn't something you do late in the game. You treat it like security or bilingualism. You want to make sure that you're doing it all throughout, but most importantly, from the beginning, in that we are starting from its genesis, or when it starts. We need leadership. You guys have a huge role to play in stewarding this stuff. And we can make new innovative solutions that are far more interactive and engaging for our own employees and for the Government of Canada and for Canadian citizens by trying to push the envelope with technology. But it really takes leadership. Someone has to be saying, this is important. And I think we have enough on the horizon to get the support everywhere on this topic. So we have a real opportunity to evolve the way we do business in so many areas and so many places. But it really takes that leadership. And we also need to inject this stuff formally. It's not enough to say, are we doing it, or ask. Make it a part of our governance. Make it a part of our gating. Make it a part of our processes. Make it a part of our planning. Make it a part of our architecture, like we're seeing out of the new modern updates that are coming out of TBS. And as they roll into departments, it'll be important that we take that and we define it in a more solid way at the operational level. Because often where this stuff falls down is also when we try to operationalize things. Like, for example, yes, we're asking for multifunction printers. We've asked what the standards, we've included standards. But if nobody knows where to go to find out which ones are accessible, which ones offer what features, or how you go about using these things, it may not benefit anybody. We may have missed an important part of this. So it isn't one person's job or one area's job or one department's job. It's really about building an ecosystem. And it's not a lot of extra work. I want to assure you that from the beginning, I've been involved in a number of projects where accessibility and inclusive design were really part of the first stages of an activity. And when we do that, we can tremendously change the landscape. My favorite example of that is in one department they told me, oh, well, there's only 12 companies that make a laboratory information management system for our science-based activities. None of them could possibly be accessible. Well, they assumed, and when you assume, you kind of get what you assume. If you don't ask for it, you don't get what you want. So they actually were convinced, and they put the requirements into their RFI. They signaled the industry. They said, we're going to be buying a new system. How many of you guys can meet what standard and at what level? Of the 12 companies, 75% of them said that they already met it at the silver level, or that they could meet it within the next year. The others said that they could meet it within 2 years. Ultimately saying that often we make the assumption that there's nothing that's accessible and nothing can be made accessible, and oh, it's impossible to meet these standards. But it really isn't hard when we're explicit and when we're providing a black and white guidance in this space. And it's really about building that ecosystem, and also about recognizing that it's not something you do once. It's something that technology changes, the environment changes, the solutions we're building and using change, and how we implement them change. So it's something that we're going to be constantly striving and evolving. But we can certainly change things. We can certainly do it in an iterative fashion. We can start to document what we're asking for use the Accessible Procurement Toolkit from the EU. We've used it on a number of activities very successfully, and I can say that if you need to know more on that, be happy to meet with you on that topic. And lastly, that you're not alone. We're all in this together. There's great resources, great information, great training, great support. And so that's what I will, I think we're at 10:30 almost.
After 10:30.
I would say that's what I would leave you with and ask for questions at this point and say, I hope you've seen a little glimpse of both the end user side of job accommodation and adaptive technology, and also the enterprise side of inclusive design and accessibility. And leave it open for questions at this point. And anybody who just held their hand up to the blind guy to ask the question, I may or may not be ignoring you, you never know. Go for it.
My name is George Tolkachev, and Jeff, we met quite a few times, and my question is about web accessibility. I was specializing in web accessibility testing since it became popular within government of Canada, and through my experience, I realized that sometimes it's not possible to provide full accessibility when it comes to rich presentations, such as graphics and so on. And through my experience, I found out, well, it's probably easier to provide with the textual information. So what is the approach, like in your Jeff's world, like what would you approach, what would you recommend? Like what is the best practices for rich presentations and technologies, when it comes to the advanced presentation using different graphics, interactive, and so on.
So I'll take it, and then I'll hand it to Julianne if she wants to fill in the blanks along the way. It's actually a really good question, and I'm gonna use one of my own personal experiences in this space, which was working with the Canada School. Years ago, we had much the same discussion in terms of they had a number of courses that weren't meeting the most up-to-date standards. They wanted those courses to be interactive. They wanted them to be graphically rich. They wanted them to have all the bells and whistles that make it vibrant and engaging. And they also wanted to be accessible. And it's not something that they could turn on a dime to solve. We spent 5-6 years, maybe more, working with them on that piece, both in various groups, in various areas. We started with taking a couple of courses and looking at what needed to be done. They started from, so to give you my favorite example, at the time, the IMIT training course for basics in IM, or information management, for a blind user, if you loaded a screen reader, none of the content was read, and all the controls just read button, 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 button. So no play, no pause, no rewind, no nothing for videos, or for even for the course material itself. And that's great if you have a shirt to have button, 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 button. But when you're trying to understand a course, there's a lot more that goes into that. So they started, and they didn't look to solve it tomorrow. They first separated it. They said, well, let's build up a two-door experience first. So we will have an inaccessible and an accessible version for a period of time as we figured out what needed to be in these things in order to make them accessible. They also realized that they needed to change the tools that they were making the courses with, because some of those tools were incapable of producing accessible content. As I was saying earlier, if you have a rock, you can paint it as orange as you'd like and squeeze it as hard as you'd like, but if it doesn't have the juice, it doesn't have the juice, and you'll be squeezing that thing forever. and they iteratively improved over time. Today, their courses are engaging, their courses are accessible, and they have one course that is inclusive by design. But it took a lot of different components and a lot of thought to get there, and a lot of back and forth. Like, we spent time with our testing crew. So we've got people who are experts in each category of disability and technology. We have end users who went through the material and talked about the barriers that they were encountering. We evaluated it from a standards compliance perspective, and we didn't try to boil the ocean. We did an iterative solution based on our lessons learned, and today I'm very proud of the material they create because I think it's top-notch in many respects, and it definitely has a lot of those engaging pieces. But in their case, they had to build it because they already had stuff, and they had to evolve it over time. And we'll likely have a similar approach where we'll have to prioritize and identify challenges. But if we look at even the current legal framework, it says we're supposed to be respecting the dignity and independence of the individual and only accommodating with that second version after we've addressed the first three. So even to be in compliance with the duty to accommodate policy, technically we should be building, say, that course inclusive by design and accessible by default, which is the approach they're taking now.
So I would actually like to follow up a bit on that. And if you're talking about things more along the lines of accessible data visualizations and data analytics and things, it actually comes down to how you've conceptualized the design of what you're putting together. So if you are putting together something in, say, React.js or Vue or something like that, it's to make sure what you're doing to the DOM actually doesn't impact the accessibility tree, or when it rebuilds it, it's giving the right information to the adaptive technology. So what happens a lot of the time is people don't understand the impact on their code, and they've trashed the entire accessibility tree, and they're not getting the information. So the elements that should be navigatable, or using things like ARIA Live or ARIA alerts that are going to actually update with live information to give what's actually changing on something that's dynamic. There's definitely accessible ways now to do that, and it's about being aware as a developer what to be looking for. So there is no reason that some of these can't, like, we've actually assessed some very complex interactive things, some out of TBS and other departments, where they're 50, 60, 70% of the way there, and if they make those modifications, they may actually come to have a much more inclusive experience. Because if you take everything and make it text, you're losing a lot. You have people who are visual spatial learners, people with cognitive and learning disabilities who need that interaction, but also may use a keyboard or a document reader or use keyboard because they have physical access related issues. So when we actually follow those things and are aware of what matters, it'll help a lot. There's some really good courses on creating a web accessibility and empathy from Google, and there's a few others that actually talk about that kind of thing. There's a lot of podcasts on that information that will say, okay, you have this thing, it's really dynamic. If I hover over it, these things change. How do you make those elements actually read to somebody? How do you make those elements interactive and known to be interactive? Because one of the common things I find is that you might have something you have to hover over with a mouse to see that there's an interaction, and you never ever get that interaction with the keyboard. It's also not textually anywhere because somebody didn't realize that they actually had to hover. So it's making those elements, and when you're designing it and you're going through and you say, okay, I'm doing a cognitive walkthrough. I'm doing step A to X. Could I do all of those things and see all the components and things that I needed to see? And the technology is there. It's just the knowing how to use it. So.
Recognizing there is no standard user, and that's the critical part of this. And it starts with the data you create. So even in the data that you start with, there's a component there and works and weaves its way through the whole activity.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Hi, Jeff, Julianne, and Jean-Marc. Martin Lachance from Statistics Canada.
Salut, Martin.
I like the idea of the procurement toolkit. And often employees are facing the decision after the fact, you know. I'm just thinking of Phoenix System, for example. I got an error on my pay. I was told you have to check your pay stubs, but the system is totally not accessible. And, you know, the decision maker put themselves under hardship because no consultation were done before, I believe. Same thing with, in StatScan, they changed the printers. It's a very nice system. Everywhere in the complex, you may swipe your ID card and print your job. However, it's a touch screen with the only accessible way is the color contrast and maybe font size. I don't know. There's no way for me to get something printed as well. So often we are placed in front of the fact, after the fact, and how can we react to this? Because, if StatScan wants to make their printers accessible, they have to change all of these. And I don't know how the duty to accommodate or the human rights have to be involved in that situation. What is, without causing undue hardship, how employees may react to that? And will the new legislation prevent things like that? So it's a
That's
open
a
question.
complex question, dude.
It's an open question.
But it's the reality of the space, right? And I think you just made it very real for many people here in that this is the scenario we face when we don't ask for these things and when we hope that someone's going to step forward where we really should be doing this stuff inclusively. So in terms of answering your question sort of three ways, I'll just say when you talk about printers, there's a number of multifunction printers that have the ability to be completely usable without sight, including, for example, Canon and I think Ricoh and a few others that all have a module that can be put into the device to make it talk. But we have to ask for it when we buy it or when we release it or when we contract it.
Because you may see that the firmware is just disabled and it actually was a printer that has features that might work for you and allow you to actually access the information that you want, but that may now be a service amendment to adding access to a feature that they didn't ask for.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of asking your question around the shift of things, well, if it ever got to a court case, the question would be asked, well, what did they do to make sure that people with disabilities were included or able to use those new technologies? And it sounds like your answer would be you don't seem to have any evidence of the fact that they did. So that would be definitely something to address. And maybe you can't address it immediately now that they've already purchased it, but you can certainly address it iteratively. So for example, in some departments when they were looking at multifunction printers, they said, well, at least one in every building has to be usable first, and then we'll make it one on every floor, and then we'll make it all of them when we replace these things. Mm-hmm. To me, it's okay, at least at this stage, to be able to say that we have a plan and we're going to go forward with it. What's interesting is the legislation will likely ask us to report on what we've done to be inclusive, recognizing we have three areas. We've got the enterprise systems and software. We've got the workplace devices, including those multifunction printers, but also the phones and the desktop computers and the laptops and the this and that, and also around the solutions that end users might need with disabilities. So how do they get access to what they need in a timely fashion as well? And then how did we look at it from an implementation standpoint beyond procurement? So I hope I gave you an answer there. Julianne, anything you want to add?
I would add just one thing, because it becomes a lesson learned of something that was not asked for that needed to be. One of the things you're seeing now a lot of the time with the procurement is there are consultations or what they're calling industry days and things like that, and it's really a good opportunity to step up and ask. Like I've participated in the AI industry day where I literally just came, asked a question and made sure that it was on the table. I did it the same thing with the HR and pay system one, where I was actually able to get a verbal commitment that yes, the new system is going to meet these accessibility requirements. It is going to fall in line with that legislation. And it's like something that we can actually have as a tangible thing. And then what we need to ensure we're doing is the following up and saying, were users consulted? Did people actually have like focus groups that talk about these kinds of things to make sure that we're not missing pieces and that we're asking for it? And if we're asking for it, you might actually find that it exists.
Yeah. And that's where you guys play probably the biggest role as people working in information and communication technology. You guys are going to be more often around those tables than anybody else. And so if you ask that question, what standard are we meeting? At what level? How are we going to implement this in an inclusive way? What user consulting with people with disabilities have we done? And also, you can also come over and say, have you gone to see ACT? If you're in the federal government, we are available as a resource to help people get steered in the right direction and understand the requirements and move the yardstick forward. So don't think you're alone.
Safe and easy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Oh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you very much. So if anybody wants to see the tools and tech afterwards, we're going to be here for a couple minutes.
Okay, I'll be really brief. So yes, accessibility by design makes a lot of sense. Use the standards. There's a slew of creative solutions available. Take some engineering and some ingenuity to put those things together. So really interesting stuff. There's no standard user. I'm going to take that away and remember it. No standard user. Think of those virtual wheelchairs, but also those virtual ramps as well. We have a role to play, and I really want to thank Jeffrey, Jean-Marc, and Julianne for their presentation today. Really useful, and this is such a critical priority for all of us. So thank you very much. And now for door prizes. We have names, we have bags, I think we have books. And we have books, so I will call it the names, and you can come and choose your door prize. All right, names, Bob.